Trump, Putin, Xi, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk. These are the people who are challenging the status quo. And it's always the people that are the underdogs, that are challenging an overarching system that become the heroes. Even if the people challenging, even if that system that is overarching is meant to be good, even if the people rising up against it espouse things like nationalism and protectionism and things that have historically been problematic, the very fact that they are challenging the status quo is what makes them heroic. So globalization is getting a bit of a rough time right now, like a really rough time. Like, you got a lot of people who are trying to sabotage this thing. And look, eventually I'll be doing a video on whether it can be saved or whether it truly does just need to fall apart and be replaced by something new, even if that new thing is nationalism and protectionism and the kind of stuff that used to get us in trouble. And I mean serious trouble. And again, I'm not saying nationalism and protectionism are bad. I think there are certain things that they do that could actually be at certain times be useful. But I'm saying that these movements have typically historically seen problems with them. In today's video, I'm going to be looking at some key suspects. And I'm going to be identifying, right, which of our key suspects, it's going to be like a murder mystery. And I'm going to be thinking, right, who killed globalization? Who really killed globalization? Was it Trump? Was it Putin? Was it Xi? Was it someone else? I'll be doing another section on mystery people. And I'm going to finally conclude by saying, okay, identifying who I think, or who or what I think it was, and also why the system may have had some problems with that as well. I want to start by saying that I'm actually quite pro-globalization. I think it's done a lot of benefits for the world. But I am aware that it has had some problems. But before we dive into it, do make sure you hit the like button and subscribe. World Order covers all things geopolitics, macroeconomics, and technology. I also do the World Order red and black labels for those interested in higher forms of storytelling. So do go check those out once you're done with this video. Without further ado, let's dive into it. So I'm going to start with like a very brief history of globalization. For those that don't know, globalization is this belief that the world can become more interconnected, and this interconnection can come in various different ways. A common rule of law that treats all human beings with some degree of dignity and gives us some rights. An interconnected world that allows us to travel to different places, to meet different people, interact with different people, get to know them, okay, trade goods, services, invest in different areas, different companies, help all. It's basically trying to get everyone to just be nicer, more tolerant, and to grow peacefully and prosperously with one another. And that sounds great. And look, believe me when I say during the 90s, early and mid 2000s, this was all the hype. This was all the rage. Okay, everyone was psyched for globalization. Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, my guys, man, my guy. Until Tony Blair went and started bombing everyone. But he was my guy for a long time there. And globalization was the thing. Okay, and when you explain it in the idealistic way that I have done, it almost makes you think, how could anyone, yeah, Trump, Putin, whatever, how could anyone actually go against this system? And believe me when I say, I feel like my childhood was great in some ways. The Western child in me was great. The Middle Eastern side of my childhood was a bit more skeptical. But the Western child in me had a great time growing up in the 90s and 2000s when, you know, because globalization is essentially like what you could grow and develop in one country is suddenly accessible in another country. So I live in the UK, but, you know, UK was dominated by America during the 90s and 2000s. I'd get back home and I'd watch The Simpsons, okay? In a non-globalist world, that wouldn't be a thing. Simpsons would have been restricted to the United States. But in the globalized era, peak globalized era, like 90s and 2000s, right? Peak globalization. Simpsons was everything to me. And then when I wasn't watching The Simpsons, I'd be listening to Eminem, okay? Eminem, 50 Cent, Jay-Z, Kanye. This is what I mean. Globalization opens everything up and you get exposed to so many things that you wouldn't have had if you were just growing up in your own country. Now, these are very subjective to me, but on a bigger scale, globalization did help shift a lot of people out of poverty and increase a lot of people's wealth. One of the problems, which I'm going to come on to a little bit later, is a lot of rich people grew exceedingly rich and other people grew less so. So even if you're a poor person, your income's growing a little bit, it doesn't mean much when the person next to you is growing like by a much bigger amount. And this was one of the big problems of globalization. It's like if we're to take maybe AI or chip making, which is a massive thing today, okay? Well, look, so how globalization would work is that you'd have like some people in the United States, maybe people in like Silicon Valley designing the chip. and then they would then get people to mine rare earths in China, okay, and then their people would then import machines from maybe the Netherlands or from Japan in order to turn the rare earth elements into chips. But then to do that, you'd get people in Taiwan to assemble these things, and then you'd take ships and then export them throughout the rest of the world. And do you see how globalization works? You have lots of specialized areas which all work together and create a final product that's actually quite cheap. And the whole theory was that, well, if we connect this globalist, interconnected world, well, then no country would go to war anymore, because if any one country did, it would sabotage its role in the interconnected chain, and that would make everyone poorer. And this whole fear about making everyone poorer would deter people from war and nationalism and nationalist rivalries. So it didn't make sense anymore. A lot of people bought into this, and for a long time it worked, but there were constantly figures on the fringe who were warning against giving into this way of thinking too much. I'm thinking of people like John Mearsheimer. I'm talking about people like Francis Fukuyama was the globalist champion. I'm talking about people like Samuel Huntington. There were these thinkers about, and eventually these figures would become political figures like Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, and eventually Trump, Putin, and Xi, who I'm going to move on to talk about. Before I talk about our key suspects, I'm just going to look at my notes and see if there's anything I've left out. Oh yeah, so look, 1999-2000 was, you could argue 1999-2000 was the peak of globalization, when talks begin to get China to enter the World Trade Organization, which basically removed barriers between China and the rest of the world. And suddenly you've got what Nixon and Kissinger envisioned in the 70s becomes alive. You've got people investing in China. It's a new market, right? So you can go build a factory in China and get cheaper labor to work on your product, whatever you want to make, and then ship it back over to the UK, where you could sell it for a massive profit. And this was great for the industrialists, the entrepreneurs, the capitalists, and the globalists, but it left a lot of working people behind. So you see it both in the UK and in America, where you have these just massive deindustrialized zones where no one has a job anymore, especially for the working class, right? So it came at their expense. And I think a lot of people put the new global identity, or the individual identity, above the national identity, the commitment to your fellow man, to your fellow national brother. Okay, this whole movement began with Reagan and Thatcher. And Thatcher's famous quote, "There is no society anymore." I think I'm paraphrasing, but it was something along the lines of, there is no society doesn't exist anymore. It's all about the individual and how much money you can make. And that epitomizes globalization, because you do kind of overlook your commitments to the nation state and your fellow national man, if there was ever such a thing. This was huge during World War II era. It's become a diluted, a less important thing in the globalized world. And some critics have a big problem with that. I'll briefly describe the three-tier model as well. So look, basically for a nation state to be healthy, this is a theory I've only come across recently, but for a nation state to be healthy, you need essentially three levels of industry, or three sectors, right? You need your agricultural sector, your industrial sector in the middle pyramid, and then on the top you have your services, which is where people start making the really good money. And it almost feels like the United States and the UK and many other Western countries thought they could just do away with this middle section, this industrialization section that they'd already done during the 18 and 1900s. And which no factory worker was ever truly happy with, right? Well, they thought they could just ditch this, get China, India, Mexico, whatever developing country to do that for them, and then every person in the Western countries would go straight up to the top tier of the pyramid, where they'd get involved in the service industry. Remember Tony Blair? Education, education, education. Well, this was all part of the plan. The Westerners didn't need to do that second tier work anymore. Let's all just educate our population so that they would be at the top tier of a globalized world. But that didn't happen. Instead, when you ship your industrial base out to places like China, India, Mexico, whatever, they get increasingly good, not just at that middle section, but they learn to do the top section as well. They start learning how to design these things. And so that, combined with the nationalist policies implemented by places like China, for example, which never truly opened up, it retained some of those nationalist protectionist policies, it subsidized its industries, And that created a problem. It fractured the globalist framework which America and England were trying to impose on it. So China, if you are a globalist and a committed globalist, then China has to take some of the blame as well. But we'll move on to that in a bit. Let's move on to the suspects, okay? Because I want us to discuss these big three, okay, before we move on and conclude about less who and what, okay? But look, let's start with Trump, because Trump, you could argue that Xi and Putin maybe have played as big a role in dismantling globalization as Trump has, but let's not lie, Trump's been the most vocal about destroying this system, which is ironic as well, because since the end of World War II, no country has championed globalization more than America. It stuck by globalization between 1944/45 and 1989, when the only countries opposing it were the communist ones championed by the Soviet Union. But then in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, well, then America was free to spread globalization to every corner of the world, and then you have the official era of globalization between 1990 and 2025. In my opinion, that's the unipolar moment, and it's the globalist moment as well, which I feel like is now ended in some ways. I'm not saying globalization is officially done away with. I think this new world order we're entering will retain some elements of globalization, but it might be globalization in a more localized form, maybe a more imperialistic form, maybe a more nationalist form as well. It'll be some kind of synthesis of all these ingredients. So let's come back to Trump, because I really do need to elaborate on this guy, right? So Trump comes to power in 2016-17. Yes, 17 is when his term starts, and he takes this big, great sledgehammer and starts destroying this globalist system, this interconnected structure that keeps the world cooperating and on peaceful and prosperous terms, again, with some caveats, by the way. So he starts by withdrawing from NAFTA, right? He says that this free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico is coming at the expense of American workers, and he rearranges the agreement so that America gets to develop some more manufacturing jobs in America, right? He then comes after the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is basically this agreement with America and 11 other countries in the Pacific to embrace free trade with one another, to encourage investment between one another, and so on. This one didn't make a lot of sense to me at first, because I was thinking, how could Trump pull away from something like this? This is a benefit. You know, this is like keeping China out. It's encouraging trade, investment, and growth with a very important part of the world, a developing part of the world, a very exciting part of the world. And when I looked into it, it became apparent that when you want to get anything done in these big multilateral institutions like the TPP, it takes time, right? And this is something Trump hates: red tape, having to just take things slowly and take other people into consideration. Just take a look at some of the things that Trump would have to do under the TPP, right? You'd have to consider labor standards, you'd have to consider environmental protections, you'd have to consider intellectual property rules, you'd have to consider digital trade rules, you'd have to consider courts for resolving disputes. All of this would slow business down, and I think Trump basically looked at it and said, you know what, why don't we just do things bilaterally? Why don't we just do things on a country-to-country basis, right? Because for Trump, basically, it's much easier to go up to... Put yourself in Trump's position. Would you rather approach 11 countries at once and take all those concerns into consideration before making any business decisions, right? Having to sit there, having to wait for days, months, years even, to get anything done? Or would you rather go up to a country and say, you're going to accept our business, and if you don't, we'll attack you? Right? The second is rawer, much harsher, something we want to avoid, but it's also much more direct and quicker to do. I think in an ideal world, right, you'd have somewhere in between where you have some regulations, but not so many that it deters business and prosperity for the American worker. I do have some criticisms of Trump leaving the TPP, which revolves around him leaving a framework which could have written the rules of the Pacific with countries like Japan, Australia, and the UK, the countries that could be won over by China. You could question the extent that they would move towards China. China has asked to be in the TPP, but its invitation is still its acceptance is still pending. Trump pulled away from the WHO, the World Health Organization. He criticized NATO, still does criticize NATO, and pulled away from the Paris Climate Accords. Pulled away again when he came back into office. And since coming back into office, has imposed tariffs on everyone. It's insane. A 10, 20%, 25% on practically everyone, and most significantly, plus 200% tariffs on China. He might not go through all of these tariffs. I think it's actually quite likely that he'll reduce tariffs on a lot of these countries, which he knows he has to have some free trade with. But I think, if anything, the tariffs were motivated technologically, geopolitically, which I've covered in a previous video, so check that out after this one. But also, it officially cements the decoupling with China. I think China is at the heart of these tariffs, honestly. And I think, if anything, these tariffs will usher in a new Cold War between America and China. If it hasn't already started, it's becoming like 2025 may, the history books may look at 2025 the same way they look at 1947. You know how between 1945 and 1947, a Cold War was brewing between the United States and Soviets? It wasn't official, but it was brewing. You know, you have those minute meetings between Stalin and Marshall, and you had the Kennan, the long telegram by George Kennan, and you have Churchill coming to the United States saying, yeah, this this Soviet Union, you know, we should be wary of them. It was brewing, but it wasn't official. But then Truman comes out in 47 and makes that speech about how the United States will defend the liberty and free people of the world, basically. And then it officially starts, 47, 48. I think the Berlin blockade makes it official. And I think Trump's tariffs are like a moment like that, where you're like, right, this Cold War between China and America is on. Like, it's properly on. It's taking the form of a trade war right now. For years, since 2016, you could argue, it's been taking on the form of a chip war. So look, maybe the history books will actually date it earlier. So yeah, Trump is without doubt one of the biggest suspects when it comes to globalization and who killed globalization. Without doubt, one of the biggest suspects. But we've got to bear in mind that Trump is almost like a symptom of bigger historical forces here. You know, people had grown dissatisfied with globalization before Trump rose to power. Okay, a lot of the reason why Trump rose to power in the first place was because of the silent majority that globalization had left behind. So we've got to take that into consideration as well. So let's move on to China, because I really need to discuss China and Xi Jinping and why they are to some extent responsible for the death of globalization. There was so much hype around China, especially during the late 90s, early 2000s, when it first joins the World Trade Organization. Okay, a lot of people thinking that, wow, you know, we've got the world's most populated country joining forces with the world's wealthiest country. This globalization thing's gonna boom, because you've got like a market of 1.4 billion people to do business with and grow prosperous with. And you know, I remember when I was growing up, you know, a lot of Chinese students were coming to my school, and it was great. There was this real optimism about this thing. But what happened was China's like this ancient civilization with its own way of doing things. And Xi Jinping, I'm gonna move on to Putin in a bit, but Xi Jinping shares some similarities with Putin in the sense that they're both students of realpolitik. Yeah, they believe in like doing business and liberalizing to some extent, but they're not going to abandon their sense of egotism and their sense of national self. And I think a lot of Westerners overlooked this when doing business with China. And understandably so, because China did allow a lot of foreign direct investment to come in. China did begin exporting a lot of stuff to us and embracing globalization in some ways. When Xi Jinping came to power, a lot of people hoped that he would take the reforms begun by Deng Xiaoping even further. But then bit by bit, there were little things that happened that made people think, China isn't going to come around. It's not going to fully embrace globalization the way that we in the West are. And I'm going to give you a little story about Google, right? So look, check this out. So back in 2006, Google entered China and launched something called Google CN, which was like a censored version of its search engine. And the idea was, right, okay, we'll release like a toned down, censored version of our service, but eventually China will come around and open up and open up and open up, and it'll be cool. But then over time, Google became increasingly uncomfortable with the scale and nature of Chinese censorship. In 2010, Google publicly accused Chinese hackers of launching an operation or a cyber attack targeting Google and US tech companies, reportedly aiming to access Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights activists. In March 2010, Google shut down Google CN and began redirecting China's users to its uncensored Hong Kong site. This was a huge moment because you see a US company, albeit a very powerful US company, taking on the Chinese government. And China is going to be like, no, you freaking don't. Like, this is the thing. A lot of people attack China for refusing to give into the globalist system. And the globalist, the liberal in me, the globalist in me says, why China? Why don't you just come around and join this system and we can all work together? Join us. But the nationalist in me, the realist in me goes, nah, China, you do your own thing, man. You don't cave into this system. You protect your own sovereignty. China, right, is doing in the 2000s and 2010s what America did in the 1930s and even before that, 1800s America, early 1900s America, where it chooses protection and nationalism and subsidizing its own industries and helping its own industries grow And then eventually when the globalist era comes and the entire world starts opening up, American companies are ready to attack and go out there and dominate foreign markets. Well, China's doing the same thing just years later. It's doing the same thing in an era in which America wants different things. So I find the realist in me, the nationalist in me, finds it very difficult to get angry at China. The nationalist in me actually supports Xi Jinping and what he's done. But the globalist in me goes, nah, man, what are you doing? Anyway, let's get back to this Google story, right? So what happened next was China responded by tightening internet controls even further. Google services were throttled and eventually blocked in mainland China. The vacuum left by Google was filled by Baidu, which already had government support, complied with censorship rules, and received ambiguous state backing as a national champion. Over time, restrictions increased over semiconductors, AI, biotech, and so on. As the rest of the world liberalized, Xi began to fortify. A lot of people were championing Xi during the middle 2010s. You know, they were like, when Trump came into power, people were saying Xi was the true leader of globalization, not Trump. But then Xi started taking measures like increasing his presidential term in 2018 and clamping down on dissent in like Hong Kong and stuff. And a lot of people kind of lost hope with Xi. A lot of globalists lost hope with Xi. COVID was like in some ways the beginning of the end for globalization. At least it initiated the transition period, because what happened is borders close and goods stop flowing and quarantine keeps people locked in, and you suddenly get a glimpse of the world after globalization for the first time. You suddenly see how vulnerable you are if these supply chains shut, and this again is maybe one of the biggest reasons pushing national champions like Putin and Trump and Xi, because they're like, we don't want to be so reliant on others for things we need back at home. So I do sympathize to some extent. China and Xi have made no attempt to hide their desires for Taiwan and to incorporate it back in China. This has been a thing for ages. This has been a thing since the People's Republic, since China became communist under Mao, maybe even earlier than that. And again, this goes against globalization. You're not respecting the UN Charter, you're not respecting another people's right to be their own national entity. So again, Xi has to be held responsible for abandoning the globalist project to some extent, not only for his domestic policies and keeping China closed and, you know, subsidizing his own industries. I haven't spoken enough about the extent to which China subsidizes its own industries, i.e. gives them advantages at the expense of others in the global marketplace. The idea of the global marketplace was inspired by Milton Friedman, which is this like idea that states, governments shouldn't subsidize their own industries. You should let the market decide which industries flourish and which ones don't. And over time, that will give you the greatest quality service. And what Xi Jinping and China did, and again, I explained, understandably so, is they subsidized their own industries in what was supposed to be a rules-based and free market, basically. China has also been accused of helping Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. And again, the invasion of Ukraine goes against globalization in so many ways. You know, here's this country, Ukraine, that wants to be a liberal democracy, and it can't because Russia insists on it being a satellite of Russia. And this actually leads me quite nicely onto Putin and Europe. I'm going to do Putin and Europe in one category because I do want to move on to the conclusion, which I believe is the most important part of this video. So Putin and Europe are really interesting because I don't think it's interesting. It's the language itself, Putin in Europe, just shows you the lack of unity and leadership in Europe, which for me is a problem. But look, I don't think they've played as big a role in undermining globalization as America today, and then China as well. But they have played a role. Russia because of its commitment to running the world in a 19th century way, and Europe because of its inability to see anything other than idealism. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Let's start with Putin, because Putin is like the OG gangster. Yeah, he's the inspiration for Trump in some ways. Putin's this guy who's coming of age during the Cold War, back when the Soviet Union, yeah, not quite what it used to be, but it's still on a global stage a great power, right? And I think Putin feels quite a lot of pride for that moment. He famously, you've heard this quote 100 times, no doubt, but Putin famously said, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Something along those lines. And yeah, look, I think Putin likes this idea of Russia being a great power. Even if it's not quite the level of China and the United States, he likes that idea. And this ties into why Putin has in some ways sabotaged the globalist project, because globalization is basically the withering away of the nation state. It encourages governments to lessen their power so that individuals can have more power. That's partly at the heart of globalization. And Putin doesn't believe in that. Putin believes in a strong nation state, a strong Russia with its own sphere of influence, with Ukraine, with Georgia, with Belarus, with all these kind of Eurasian countries under its thumb. Russia looks at the world as a great power, like an imperial power, in ways that the United States tried not. The United States encouraged people not to do. It's ironic because during the late 90s, early 2000s, I think a lot of people were quite optimistic about Putin. Bill Clinton, I think, famously said that this is someone we can work with. George Bush famously said that he looked at the man in the eye and saw his soul. To which that guy who ran in 2008, who was the guy who ran against Obama? What was his name? It was like McCain, right? McCain then comes up and says, yeah, I looked him in the eye and I saw a K, a G, and a B. And I was like, this guy, man, this guy's funny. Ex-KGB agent. That's never going to leave him. It's in some ways cool and in some ways quite dark. The storyteller in me is quite awed by Putin's KGB background, because I kind of like that part of me that likes fantasy and James Bond and stuff looks at Putin as a Russian James Bond in some ways. But then the realistic side of me goes, yeah, but you do realize this guy was probably involved in some dark, dodgy stuff, right? And I go, oh. But look, Putin first takes the blowtorch to the globalist system in 2008 when he invades Georgia. Yeah, Georgia, this country that wanted to liberalize, wanted to democratize, wanted to be away from Russia's hold on it, and then Russia sends the tanks in and goes, no, you don't, you belong part of us. He then takes it further by annexing Crimea in 2014, and then it becomes very official in 2022 when he invades Ukraine, right? There's no thing that's as explicitly anti-globalist as what Putin does in 2024. Again, I've created content on this in the past explaining why I think he did this. I think he had, as a nationalist, I think he had some concerns about NATO enlargement and so on. But yeah, as a globalist, I think it's reprehensible and it doesn't make sense, right? So let's move on to Europe, because I feel like Europe is a bit of a tragic hero, okay? Europe's the one who, I feel like it really did want the globalist system to work, primarily because Europe's so reliant on everyone else for so many ththings. You see Europe and it's like, okay, well, where do you get your gas from? Oh, we get it from Russia. Right, okay, well, where do you get your security from? Oh, we get it from America. Okay, do you do anything yourself? I mean, where do you get your goods from? Oh, we get them from China. It's like, do you guys do anything yourselves? Like, that's what I'm thinking of Europe when I look at it sometimes. I'm like, you speak well. Have you ever met a European? They're lovely. Most of them are really, like, you know, I've got a friend called Alex, and he identifies more with Europe than he does with Americans. We're both Brits, right? But he identifies more with Europeans than he does Americans. I'm a British person that likes to identify more with Americans than maybe Europeans. But look, honestly, if you haven't, go to Europe because it's awesome. Go to France for the food. Go to Germany for the beer. Go to Italy for the pizza and stuff. It's awesome. But there's also this part of you that goes, are you guys just like a museum these days? Like, do you like play any influence in the world today? Like, can you create anything yourselves? Like, again, I get that this is a simplistic and generalized assumption on Europe, and there'll be people who are much better on Europe than me, by the way. I'm pretty decent on America, Russia, China. With Europe is I'm gonna be honest, like, Europe's the one I know less about. So if you have something to say on Europe and why you do rate Europe in the comments, then put it in the comments and let me know. I'll happily listen to you. But I just find Europe frustrating. Like, Europe's the kind of person that goes up to Putin and wags its finger and goes, yeah, but what about your human rights? What about your environmental shortcomings? And Russia's the kind of person that goes, yeah, but we have tanks. What are you going to do? And this is the problem. I feel like Europe's an idealist living in a very realistic world. And now that the world has become more realistic and given way to great power politics, Europe's a bit screwed. And Europe now needs to catch up in that sphere. Let's move on to the final part of this video, which is, right, well, look, Trump and Xi and Putin all need to be held account to some extent, right? And maybe Europe for not doing enough, okay? But the seed for globalization's destruction was planted early on, and I'll explain what I mean by this. So, look, 1992 was it that Fukuyama releases The End of History, and everyone buys into globalization as the be-all and end-all, and it was very hard to disagree with him. Because globalization offered so many benefits. Economically speaking, it was the best thing ever, right? It didn't make sense to challenge, and so everyone buys into it. Okay, with America as the one leading the charge. I've been thinking very deeply about this, kind of why did globalization fail? And I will eventually release a separate video on either why it failed or why it's seeing a temporary setback, okay? I've heard critics say that money isn't necessarily everything. It's very important, but it isn't everything. And maybe globalization put money at the heart of things. But I don't agree with that. As you see, in a truly globalized system, you're allowed to forge your own path and create your own meaning and establish your own identity, an identity free of one associated with your state or nation state. It's something I'm doing right now with this channel, okay? I'm using the freedoms I've been granted to create my own meaning and my own system of wealth creation and so on. And yet not enough people did this. And the question is why? I mean, did globalization invite comfort and complacency? Did people, by becoming on average a bit wealthier, become lazier and more disillusioned and feel like they have less to fight for? Maybe, but I don't entirely buy that. The most interesting criticism I have of globalization, and why I think it's seeing either a setback or a failure, is because it became the system that everyone adhered to without question. International rule of law, tolerance between individuals, freedom of goods, freedom of flow, freedom of investment, democracy, all of these things, right? Everyone came to adhere to these without question. And it's as soon as everyone adheres to everything without question that thing becomes an evil thing that needs to be challenged. And today, the Rebel Alliance takes the form of people like Trump, Putin, Xi, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk. These are the people who are challenging the status quo. And it's always the people that are the underdogs, that are challenging an overarching system, that become the heroes. Even if the people challenging, even if that system that is overarching is meant to be good, even if the people rising up against it espouse things like nationalism and protectionism and things that have historically been problematic, the very fact that they are challenging the status quo is what makes them heroic. And it's so ironic because we're now living in a system in which the good guys are actually the bad guys, and the bad guys have become the good guys. But this is the tragedy of history. I mean, it will always be this way. There will be one system that comes and dominates, and eventually it'll become old, it'll be defunct, it'll have problems, and the people challenging that then become the new heroes. It's just that we're going through a time in which these new heroes espouse things that have historically been problematic. But we still need to champion because they're something new, and they're a break from the system. And we essentially crave that sense of change and novelty and dynamism. And that's what the people like Trump and Musk have capitalized on. Dynamism, innovation. They really have pegged themselves with these words. And that's why they seem exciting in some ways. Even though history suggests that this could be going down quite a dark path. And that's the tragedy of history. It's the tragedy of great power politics. It's a testament to the inevitability of tragedy, which I personally believe in, okay? And there's my big revelation, guys, okay? So, I hope you've gotten something of value from this video. If you have, then give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, subscribe. World Order covers all things geopolitics, macroeconomics, and tech. But I also do the World Order red labels and the black labels for those interested in higher forms of storytelling. Do go check those out. Guys, if you'd like to follow me on available social media, then I've left them in the description below. And yeah, let me know. Like, honestly, I'd love to hear your comments. Do you agree with what I've said? Do you think we have seen the end of globalization? Or do you think this is just a temporary setback and that it'll get going again in maybe a few months' time? Let me know. And again, yeah, massive thank you for your time. Take care. Bye-bye.